Mediterranean Ancestry. Mediterranean ancestry spans the sunlit coasts of southern Europe, the Levant, and North Africa, regions shaped by early agriculture, dense cities, and centuries of infectious pressure. Life in these environments forged a distinctive genetic landscape, one tuned to malaria, famine, and epidemic disease long before modern medicine arrived. Several hidden disadvantages emerged from these ancient defenses. Traits like beta thalassemia and G6PD deficiency spread because they disrupted malaria's life cycle inside red blood cells. Yet outside that context, they reveal costs: chronic anemia, deadly food allergies, and dangerous medication reactions. Similarly, mutations behind familial Mediterranean fever likely sharpened immune vigilance against historic plagues, but now trigger painful, recurring inflammation that requires lifelong management. Other trade-offs are quieter. Lower lactose tolerance reflects dairy practices centered on fermentation rather than fresh milk. Variants affecting skin pigmentation, while subtle, can increase vulnerability to ultraviolet damage under intense Mediterranean sun. Each reflects adaptation to a precise historical niche. Mediterranean genetics tell a story of survival through adversity, but when threats fade, the protections they shaped remain, sometimes as burdens, echoing battles no longer fought. East Asian Ancestry. East Asian ancestry encompasses populations shaped by long agricultural histories, dense settlements, and stable regional ecosystems across China, Korea, Japan, and neighboring regions. Over centuries, these societies adapted genetically to rice-based diets, endemic pathogens, and localized environmental pressures, producing distinctive metabolic and immune traits. Some of these adaptations reveal hidden disadvantages in the modern world. A well-known example is the ALDH2 enzyme variant, common in East Asians, which causes alcohol flushing by allowing toxic acetaldehyde to accumulate. While this once discouraged excessive drinking, repeated exposure today quietly increases the risk of esophageal cancer. Similarly, certain HLA immune gene variants, refined by evolution to fight regional infections, can dangerously overreact to modern pharmaceuticals, triggering severe reactions like Stevens-Johnson syndrome. Other vulnerabilities emerge at the intersection of genes and environment. Limited lactose digestion reflects ancestral diets without dairy, now clashing with modern food systems. Genetic susceptibility to eye elongation, once harmless, combines with intense near-work and low sunlight to fuel widespread myopia. Even cancer risks, such as nasopharyngeal carcinoma, trace back to immune trade-offs in controlling ancient viruses. What once ensured survival now demands careful navigation. East Asian ancestry illustrates how evolutionary success can carry quiet costs when the world changes faster than genes can follow. Balkan Ancestry. Balkan ancestry reflects a crossroads of civilizations shaped by Slavic migrations, Mediterranean influence, and centuries of life in rugged, mountainous terrain. Geography fragmented populations into isolated valleys and villages, where small communities persisted for generations with limited outside mixing. This history left a genetic landscape rich in diversity at the regional level, yet unusually concentrated within local enclaves. Several hidden disadvantages arise from this pattern. Malaria once reached Balkan wetlands, favoring the spread of thalassemia traits and, at lower levels, sickle cell variants. These genes protected carriers, but still carry the risk of severe inherited anemia when combined. Isolation also amplified chance mutations. Founder effects caused rare recessive disorders to become unexpectedly common in specific ethnic or village groups, from metabolic conditions to childhood muscular dystrophies. Endogamy, when two people from the same small community have children, further increased the likelihood that silent mutations would meet. In some rural communities, this raised rates of congenital deafness and developmental disorders. Other vulnerabilities were tightly bound to place itself. Genetic sensitivity to local environmental toxins contributed to Balkan endemic nephropathy, a kidney disease once confined to particular farming regions. Balkan genetics reveal how history can narrow choice. When populations remain small and still, chance leaves a heavier mark, turning geography into destiny and inheritance into an echo of long-forgotten isolation. Hispanic and Latino ancestries. Hispanic and Latino ancestries arise from one of history's most complex genetic intersections. Indigenous American lineages, shaped by ancient migration into the Americas, later blended with European and African genes after the 15th century. This admixture produced extraordinary biological diversity, but also layered adaptations forged for radically different worlds. Some inherited traits reflect survival under scarcity. Metabolic variants that once conserved energy during feast and famine cycles now operate in environments of constant abundance, increasing vulnerability to type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. Similar evolutionary logic appears in cholesterol metabolism. Genes that efficiently reclaim cholesterol on low-fat ancestral diets now predispose many to gallstones when paired with modern nutrition. Other disadvantages stem from chance rather than adaptation. High frequencies of folate processing variants can raise the risk of neural tube defects without sufficient dietary folate. In isolated communities, founder mutations, such as those behind Hermansky-Pudlak syndrome in Puerto Rico, amplified rare disorders through generations. Even diversity itself carries consequences. Highly mixed immune gene profiles can make finding compatible bone marrow donors more difficult. Admixture tells a story of resilience and survival across continents, yet it also reveals how genetic richness, when placed in new conditions, can quietly complicate modern health in unexpected ways. West African Ancestry. West African ancestry emerges from some of humanity's most ancient and genetically diverse populations, shaped by tropical climates, intense sunlight, and relentless infectious pressure. For thousands of years, survival in this environment demanded biological defenses that were powerful, efficient, and often uncompromising. Many of those defenses reveal sharp trade-offs. The sickle cell mutation spread widely because a single copy dramatically reduced childhood death from malaria, even though inheriting 2 copies causes a severe, life-shortening blood disorder. A similar pattern appears in the APOL1 gene. Variants that protect against deadly sleeping sickness now greatly increase the risk of kidney failure in modern settings, where the original threat has receded. Other disadvantages surface through environmental change. Genetic tendencies towards salt retention, once life-saving under heat, dehydration, and illness, now contribute to earlier and more severe hypertension. Widespread lactose non-persistence reflects historical diets without dairy, while ancient adaptations that once boosted the immune system against tropical parasites may now predispose these lineages to higher rates of autoimmune inflammation and systemic lupus. West African genetics reflect adaptation under extreme pressure. They testify to survival against forces that killed without mercy. Yet when those forces fade, the traits they shaped can linger as burdens, revealing how evolution optimizes for survival, not comfort, longevity, or modern health. Ashkenazi Jewish Ancestry. Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry reflects a historically small, tightly knit population shaped by repeated bottlenecks and centuries of endogamy in Central and Eastern Europe. This genetic isolation allowed rare recessive mutations to drift to high frequency, creating one of the most distinctive inherited risk profiles known in human populations. Several disorders illustrate this pattern: Tay-Sachs disease, Canavan disease, familial dysautonomia, and Gaucher disease all arise from missing enzymes or disrupted neural development, often appearing in infancy or early childhood despite normal birth. These conditions did not spread because they were beneficial, but because founder mutations were amplified as the population rapidly expanded. Some hypotheses suggest carriers may have had partial resistance to infections like tuberculosis in crowded medieval cities, though this remains uncertain. Cancer risk represents another significant hidden disadvantage. Ashkenazi Jews have elevated rates of hereditary breast, ovarian, prostate, and pancreatic cancers, largely driven by founder mutations in BRCA1 and 2. Roughly 1 in 40 individuals carries a BRCA mutation, about 10 times higher than in the general population, leading to earlier onset and more aggressive disease patterns. Ashkenazi genetics reveal the cost of historical survival under constraint, resilience preserved through continuity, accompanied by a concentration of biological vulnerabilities that modern screening and medicine can now help manage. Southeast Asian Ancestry. Southeast Asian ancestry comes from regions with long histories of farming, trade, and close-knit communities. Over many generations, people in places like Thailand, Vietnam, and Cambodia developed certain inherited traits that are still common today. Some of these traits are harmless on their own, but can become serious under certain conditions. One example is hemoglobin E, a very common blood trait in this region. By itself, it usually causes only mild anemia. But if a child inherits hemoglobin E along with another blood disorder called beta thalassemia, the result can be a severe illness that requires lifelong medical care. A related condition, called alpha thalassemia, can also become life-threatening when several altered genes are inherited together. Carriers remain healthy, yet the combined inheritance patterns create significant medical burden. Another inherited trait, called G6PD deficiency, affects how red blood cells handle stress. Certain medicines or illnesses can trigger sudden anemia, which can be life-threatening. In some Southeast Asian communities, a rare heart rhythm condition called sudden unexplained nocturnal death syndrome can cause sudden death during sleep that disproportionately affects young men. There is also a higher rate of a specific cancer behind the nose linked to a common virus and certain traditional preserved foods. These patterns show how inherited traits can stay quiet for generations until the right combination brings them into focus. Indigenous American Ancestry. Indigenous American ancestry traces to the first peoples who crossed into the Americas more than 15,000 years ago and then lived in near total isolation from the Old World. Over millennia, indigenous societies adapted to diverse landscapes, Arctic tundra, high mountains, dense forests, while remaining untouched by Eurasian pathogens, domesticated animals, and dairy-based diets. This long isolation carried a devastating hidden cost. Without generations of exposure to Old World diseases, indigenous immune systems lacked protective variants against illnesses like smallpox and measles. When these pathogens arrived, entire communities were overwhelmed, leading to catastrophic population collapse. Survival was not a failure of biology, but the absence of evolutionary rehearsal. Later, population bottlenecks reshaped immune genes, leaving lasting imprints on health. Other disadvantages emerged as environments changed. Metabolic traits that once preserved energy during famine now contribute to extreme rates of diabetes, fatty liver disease, and gallstones. Nearly universal lactose intolerance reflects ancestral diets without dairy, while shifts toward modern foods reveal vulnerabilities never tested before. Indigenous American genetics tell a story of extraordinary endurance, yet they also reveal how isolation, once protective, can become a liability when history abruptly rewrites the rules of survival. Arctic and Inuit Ancestry. Arctic and Inuit ancestry reflects one of humanity's most extreme experiments in adaptation. Life above the polar circle demanded survival through cold, darkness, and diets built almost entirely from animal fat. Over thousands of years, powerful genetic changes emerged, efficient, specialized, and unforgiving. Some of these adaptations carry sharp hidden risks. Variants in fat metabolism genes, such as CPT1A, optimized energy use on a high-fat diet and supported endurance through long winters. Yet in infants, the same change can impair the ability to generate ketones during fasting, making them vulnerable to sudden drops in blood sugar without warning. Other metabolic adaptations reshaped fatty acid processing, lowering cholesterol, and protecting against heart disease, but also subtly limiting growth and stature. Skin pigmentation tells a similar story. Arctic peoples relied on vitamin D from marine foods rather than sunlight, allowing darker skin to persist at high latitudes. When traditional diets fade, this coupling breaks, revealing deficiencies never faced before. Even cold tolerance traits that maintain circulation may raise blood pressure in modern indoor environments. Arctic genetics reveal evolution at its most precise. When conditions remain constant, the system works beautifully. When they change, those same refinements can become fragile points of failure. Central Asian Ancestry. Central Asian ancestry spans the heart of Eurasia, shaped by nomadic pastoralism, harsh continental climates, and ancient trade routes. Populations such as Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, Uzbeks, and Tajiks reflect a mosaic of East and West Eurasian lineages, forged through migration, isolation, and life on open steppe or high plateau. Several adaptations reveal subtle disadvantages when contexts shift. Milk digestion divides sharply along cultural lines. Pastoral nomads evolved high lactase persistence, while farming populations did not, making lactose intolerance common where modern dairy diets expand. Highland groups, especially Tibetans, carry unique oxygen regulation genes that prevent altitude sickness, yet may slightly limit hemoglobin levels at sea level, a trade-off between survival and performance. Clan-based social structure also amplified founder mutations, concentrating rare disorders within specific lineages. Even alcohol metabolism varies unpredictably, reflecting deep admixture rather than uniform ancestry. Central Asian genetics mirror movement and mixture. Their hidden disadvantages are not universal, but unevenly scattered, legacies of adaptation to extremes that no longer define everyday life. Slavic Ancestry. Slavic ancestry spans the forests and plains of Eastern Europe, shaped by late expansion, harsh winters, and repeated demographic bottlenecks. Communities often endured famine, epidemics, and long periods of endogamy, allowing chance mutations to quietly persist as populations spread and rebuilt. Some of these mutations carry serious modern consequences. Distinct founder variants in BRCA1 dramatically raise risks of breast and ovarian cancer, not through adaptation, but through genetic drift amplified over centuries. Other inherited risks, like cystic fibrosis and alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, reflect mutations that may once have conferred resistance to infectious disease, yet now predispose children to lung and liver damage when both harmful copies are inherited. The immune system reveals another trade-off. Certain HLA patterns, common in Slavic populations, heighten protection against historic pathogens, but also raise susceptibility to autoimmune diseases such as type 1 diabetes and multiple sclerosis, especially in northern climates with limited sunlight. Even behavioral vulnerabilities appear shaped by biology. The absence of alcohol-deterring enzyme variants removes a natural brake on heavy drinking. Slavic genetics reflect endurance in marginal environments. But when survival no longer hinges on plague or cold, the traits that once lingered unnoticed can surface as modern burdens, legacies of resilience that demand new forms of awareness. African American ancestry. African American ancestry reflects a complex admixture shaped by the transatlantic slave trade, combining primarily West and Central African lineages with European and occasional Native American ancestry. This history preserved powerful African genetic adaptations, often removed from the environments in which they originally evolved. Several inherited traits now carry disproportionate costs. The sickle cell allele, once protective against malaria, persists without benefit and leaves a risk of severe inherited disease. A POL1 variant, protective against African parasites, now greatly increased susceptibility to kidney failure. G6PD deficiency remains largely silent until medications or illness trigger dangerous anemia. Cancer represents another quiet disadvantage. African Americans experience higher incidence and significantly higher mortality for many cancers, including breast, prostate, colorectal, and lung cancer. Genetics contributes through variants affecting tumor suppression, hormone metabolism, and inflammation, but late detection and aggressive disease biology compound the risk. For example, prostate cancer is both more common and more lethal in African American men, even when access to care is similar. Metabolic traits further add strain. Salt-sensitive blood pressure regulation raises rates of early hypertension and heart failure, while high genetic diversity complicates bone marrow donor matching. African American genetics reflect endurance under extraordinary pressure, but when history shifts, those same inheritances can become unseen liabilities. Celtic Ancestry. Celtic ancestry traces to the Atlantic edges of Europe, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and Brittany, regions shaped by low sunlight, frequent famine, and long periods of relative isolation. These conditions fostered distinctive genetic adaptations, some of which quietly persist as modern vulnerabilities. One of the most striking is hereditary hemochromatosis, driven by HFE mutation. Exceptionally common in Celtic populations, it promotes excessive iron absorption. What may once have protected against iron deficiency during famine now allows iron to accumulate silently for decades, damaging the liver, heart, and pancreas. Cystic fibrosis presents another legacy. Celtic regions have the world's highest carrier rates, likely because carriers once gained resistance to lethal infections, even though children who inherited both mutated copies faced devastating disease before modern treatment. Skin pigmentation reveals a further trade-off. MC1R variants, producing fair skin and red hair, maximized vitamin D synthesis under cloudy skies, but sharply increased susceptibility to skin cancer under stronger sun exposure. Immune genetics add complexity. High frequencies of HLA-DQ2 predispose Celtic populations to celiac disease, an autoimmune response to gluten introduced relatively late into their diet. Even small subgroups, such as Irish travelers, carry severe founder effect disorders like galactosemia. Celtic genetics reflect survival at the margins of Europe, but traits once tuned to scarcity and shadow can become liabilities in abundance and light. French-Canadian ancestry. French-Canadian ancestry, particularly in Quebec's Charlevoix and Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean regions, traces back to a remarkably small founding population of 17th century settlers. Geographic isolation, large family sizes, and centuries of limited migration allowed chance mutations to spread widely, creating one of the clearest examples of founder effects in human genetics. Several rare disorders reach unusually high frequencies. RSACS, a progressive neurological condition, emerges in early childhood with muscle stiffness, balance loss, and impaired coordination. Hereditary tyrosinemia type 1 reflects a metabolic failure to break down an amino acid, once causing fatal liver disease in infancy before modern treatments intervened. Other conditions, such as Anderman syndrome, disrupt both brain structure and peripheral nerves, while vitamin D-dependent rickets weakens growing bones despite adequate nutrition. Even more familiar diseases appear in distinct forms. Cystic fibrosis is common, but driven by Quebec-specific mutations rather than the variants seen elsewhere in Europe. None of these traits offered clear evolutionary advantage. They spread through isolation, not selection. French-Canadian genetics reveal how history can concentrate risk. A small beginning, echoed across generations, turned rare mutations into regional legacies. Quiet reminders that ancestry can shape health in highly local, deeply personal ways. If you like this video and want to learn more about the human body, check out these other videos.